Hello again. Now, solitary confinement still exists in South African prisons. That's according to retired justice and the head of the Judicial Inspectorate for Correctional Services, an oversight body of South Africa's prisons, Edwin Cameron. He says this violates statute law, the Constitution, and the United Nations internationally embraced Nelson Mandela Rules for the treatment of detained and incarcerated persons. Cameron says there's very little evidence that solitary confinement changes behavior of those it is intended for. Let's discuss this with the retired judge, joining us now via Zoom. Justice Cameron, good afternoon. Welcome to today. Thank you very much for your time. Just first question, why do we still have solitary confinement long after it's been outlawed in the country? Why does it still exist?
There are two reasons, Dan, and what a pleasure it is to be with you and to be with your viewers as well. Dan, the one is a historical reason. And when we became a democracy, we sent some correctional experts to America, and we adopted the worst of the American system, including minimum sentences, long carceral periods, pointlessly long sentences. And we can get back to those issues another time. But one of the things they brought back was solitary confinement. It's a widespread practice in the United States. It's a terrible thing. We don't do it on the scale that happens in United States federal and state prisons, but we do it. And then the second reason, Dan, is that there really are problems with imprisonment. They are very dangerous people. I've met some of them. And we at JIX, which is the Judicial Inspectorate that I head, I'm the inspecting judge there, we're not babes in the wood. We know that there are some very dangerous gangsters. So what do you do with them? You lock them up. And we say that that's not the solution. And if you do need to lock up some very dangerous criminals, and we concede that you do, you don't lock them up in solitary confinement. That was a noxious and unacceptable apartheid practice, which we promised ourselves when we became a constitutional democracy that we would not continue with.
Are there any justifiable situations for solitary confinement?
You know, Dan, you're asking the right question. I don't think so, because solitary confinement, if I can just share with your viewers, it means that you lock someone up for 22 hours a day without meaningful human contact. And that certainly happens very close to where you and I are both sitting this afternoon in Pretoria C-Max, right outside Pretoria in the old Potgieter Street jail. It also happens at eBongweni, which is one of our most forbidding prisons. And I paid a visit there with Minister Lamola, and the Deputy Minister, Patikila Olamisa. Both of them are concerned, together with the Acting National Commissioner, Mr. Tobakale. So we are all concerned. We saw what happened at eBongweni, and there's no doubt in my mind that it's still happening. So to lock people up for that length of time isn't functional to anything. It's not functional to keeping us safe from gangsters in jail. You can find ways of reducing the length of time to conform with international prescripts, which we've undertaken to do as a respectable member of the international democratic community. And there are other ways. We are working with the Acting National Commissioner and the Deputy Minister and the Minister. We've made very practical suggestions. This isn't mollycoddling. These are basic humanity suggestions. More visits, more books, less isolation. Let me tell your viewers, Dan, that the people we saw in Pretoria C-Max, for example, it was pitiful. They were on their knees trying to get through the little post-box slivers and talk to us. They get 1 hour of exercise a day. And is it with anyone else? No. It's in an exercise cage. And their showering as well is an exercise cage away from everyone else. We say, find other ways. We appreciate it's going to require more personnel when there's exercise, because some of these gangsters do, I call them gangsters loosely, but some of these dangerous convicted inmates do want to do damage to correctional officials and to other inmates. So it is going to require operational improvements, which we appreciate. We don't shut our eyes to that. but we've got to do it. We cannot continue with this.
Yeah, I mean, solitary confinement was used by the apartheid regime, for example, Justice Cameron. Just yesterday, I was at a memorial service by the ANC of Me Ritanzanga. I mean, she, among others, like the late Mama Winnie Madikizela Mandela, in 1969 were arrested and jailed, and they were kept in solitary confinement, you know, the likes of this Joyce Kakane. So we have this history with solitary confinement. Our new laws have practically much declared solitary confinement as something that is not permitted, but it is still being done. Why is solitary confinement wrong?
Dan, I just want to pick up on one thing that you've said. President Mandela was in solitary confinement for a relatively short time, only a few days, unlike his former spouse, Mrs. Winnie Madikizela Mandela, who was in solitary confinement for far longer. And President Mandela said, being in solitary confinement, now quoting, was the most forbidding aspect of prison life. So it's wrong because it doesn't achieve what you want. Do you want to reform these people that you regard as gangsters and highly dangerous people? It doesn't do that. It does worse. It infects the whole system. I was a practitioner under apartheid, Dan, when we still had the death penalty. And I came close to it because clients of mine were hanged and some of them were nearly hanged. That brutality infects the whole system of administration of justice. Now, I've always said with the death penalty, if there is evidence that it works, that it stops murders, stops rape, then at least there'd be an argument for it. As it is, we know that there's no good evidence whatsoever anywhere in the world ever that the death penalty helps us to deal with crime. The same is true of solitary confinement.
So I guess the impact on the person would be awful. I mean, you might end up being depressed. As you said, as you were visiting CMAX prison recently with your team, some of the inmates were trying to go through that sliver of an opening on the steel doors, trying to get your attention, and they were kneeling and pleading with you. So solitary confinement must damage someone's health well-being.
Exactly, Dan. It damages the health, it damages the psychic health, it damages physical health because of the confinement and the absence of adequate exercise and light and of mental diversion. And as I've said, it damages the whole system. But let me tell you that there's very good evidence that it inflicts psychic torture on people. And we were told that. And
somebody who's found himself arrested for whatever crime. Nobody's saying if you've committed a crime, you must not be arrested and you must not be sent to jail. But if you've been kept in solitary confinement, there'll be very little correction happening, or what is it called, rehabilitation. And we are social beings. As human beings, we all suffered just now under the lockdown. We were all not coping with being locked down due to the pandemic. We are social beings, and people have to rely on contact. Now, when you are integrated back into community after your release, it's going to be very hard to fit in back, and you might just resort to crime again.
I think that's part of the problem. Dan, and I want to go back a bit more as well. You're quite right that the actual practice of solitary confinement does no one any good. And in fact, we think that it places the inmates in the way of harm to make them more vulnerable to recidivism, which is when you go back to your criminal ways. But I want to locate this in a bigger problem, Dan. We became a democracy with very high ideals. And one of the first wrong turns we took towards the end of the 1990s, still under the presidency of President Mandela, who himself had been the world's most famous prisoner for 27 years in jail in South Africa. We decided to put all of that behind us, and then we went wrong very quickly with minimum sentences, with too many life sentences, pointlessly. And I say this with great confidence to the eNCA viewers. All of those carceral interventions have no point. So solitary confinement was part of that wrong turn. And it was initially prohibited under it was initially permitted under the Correctional Services Act, the post-Mandela statute that was supposed to reform our prisons. And then it was changed to say you can only segregate. The clear implication of the legislation being you can no longer solitary confine. So it's part of a whole systemic wrong turn we took. And as I've said before, we're so scared of drowning that we're not learning to swim with our policies. There are things we can do to bring violent crime down, and we're not doing them.
So Justice Cameron, you and your Judicial Inspectorate for Correctional Services, the prisons oversight body of which you are a head, I mean, have been there. You've visited CMEX. You've been to ePhongweni as well in Kokstad, as you said, the two maximum security prisons, and you've engaged with ministers. I heard you saying that in one of the visits, Ronald Lamula was with you. So, what have you shared with the department? What are you sharing with the Department of Justice and Correctional Services about how can this problem be addressed? Because they are committing a crime themselves, correctional services, by implementing or imposing solitary confinement.
Dan, let me be a lawyer and say that I wouldn't accuse them of committing a crime, but it's an infraction against the statute and against international law. They are behaving wrongly. They are enforcing a wrong practice. So we've told the minister this. We've sent a report to Minister Lamola, to Deputy Minister Patikile Holomisa, to Acting National Commissioner Makoti Tobakale. They have our report. And at ePhongweni, we made a powerful presentation. Our legal head, Ms. Ngema Tembelihle Ngema, made a powerful presentation pointing out all the errors. So on the practical level, and I'm glad that you asked that question, Dan, we are making practical point-by-point suggestions. We're not sitting in an ivory tower and saying, oh, what you're doing is wrong, and we're going to sit here with our bleeding hearts and crying tears. No, we're making practical suggestions to the department and to the ministers, and we are hopeful that they will result in an improvement which will lead to an abolition of this pernicious practice in our carceral system.
Is there an openness to implement your practical suggestions?
Definitely. I think you know Minister Lamola is allow me to say it, I hope he doesn't mind if I say it, he's a very smart guy. He's a very good lawyer. Deputy Minister Patikile Holomisa is also a lawyer, also very savvy. And the Acting National Commissioner is equally savvy. And we engaged with them, but we'd like more action.
And the action is to end solitary confinement in South Africa?
Yes, through remedial interventions that can be applied now. One of the things, Dan, if you want to draw this to an end, let me just fit in this. One of the things we were told is that, for example, ePhongweni, where there are 600 people, most of them in solitary confinement, many of the country's most dangerous escape risks and violence risks. We acknowledge all of that. One of the things we were told is that this prison is constructed for solitary confinement, for single cell. Well, that's no excuse. The same is true of Pretoria CMAX, which is in the old death penalty block. I visited last year at the end of June. The previous time I'd been there was in order to visit the Sharpeville 6 in 1988, who were going to be executed the next morning. Now we don't have the gallows there anymore. The gallows are now a museum site, but just close by, we are practicing something second worst from execution, which is solitary confinement. And the reconstruction of the Pretoria CMAX prison doesn't justify that pernicious and unlawful practice.
Very briefly, Justice Cameron, as we conclude, are you confident, or let me say, are you hopeful, as you said, the smart guy, Ronald Lamula, will deliver?
Yes, I am. And if he doesn't, my job as inspecting judge, and I've got extremely competent and experienced officials in the inspectorate, our job is to chase after him, and we're going to do that.
Thank you very much for your time this afternoon. Always a pleasure talking to you. That's retired Justice Edwin Cameron. He's, of course, the head of the JCIS for short, which is the Judicial Inspectorate for Correctional Services. If you didn't know it, solitary confinement is being practiced in a number of prisons in South Africa, including the maximum security prisons, CMAX in Pretoria, Kgosi Mampuru, and ePhongweni maximum security prison in Kokstad in KwaZulu-Natal. But it's not supposed to be. Solitary confinement in South Africa is no longer allowed since 2008.